Hello, everyone. I see kind of folks joining now, so we are going to get started. Welcome to our webinar around breaking the bias in honor of Women's History Month and this year's 2022 International Women's Day campaign theme. My name is Christina Giordano. I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager here at All Voices, She, Her, and Hers. And for folks who aren't familiar with All Voices, we're an employee feedback management platform that really empowers folks to anonymously and safely provide feedback, ask questions, share positive input, and report things like harassment, bias, or culture issues directly to their company leadership. This week we celebrated International Women's Day, and this year's campaign theme really inspired the discussion for today. And we really want to discuss tangible ways to work together in a more gender equal world where we can mitigate bias, stereotypes, and discrimination. To set the stage for today's conversation, just a few stats. 50% of women have unfortunately reported that they have experienced gender discrimination at work. And in terms of other stats, just 3% of computing-related jobs are held by African-American women, 6% held by Asian women, and 2% held by Hispanic women. And today we are defining bias as a prejudice in favor or against one person, thing, or group compared to another, usually it considered unfair behavior. So with that, I would love to pass to our panelists who are here today. If you could share a little bit about yourself, including your name, pronouns, and the work you do at your organization, and then we will get started. Amber, I will pass to you first, and then Jen and Jess.
Thank you, Christina. My name is Amber Haggins. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently the Vice President and Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Profit. And Profit is a global management consulting firm that combines insight, creativity, data, and technology to unlock growth within organizations from a human-centered and transformational perspective. And my work is all about, making sure that there's intersectional representation across all levels at our firm, making sure that our practices and our processes are equitable and accessible for everyone at our firm. And finally, creating an environment where everyone can show up and really thrive and be successful.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So happy to be here. My name is Jennifer Vasquez, she, her. I am the VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Golden State Warriors. It is a newly created position for the organization. It's been such an amazing time for the past 2 months. I've been able to really assess, sort of going through that current state assessment to determine where there's immediate opportunities, focusing on some micro wins, but also the long term, as we know that this is a journey. It's not about the destination. Very similarly to Amber, just working on root cause analysis, the dynamics being in sports and entertainment. Oftentimes people think the Warriors, our biggest assets are on the court, but there's so much behind the court that brings this beloved sport to life. And so really ensuring that as a male-dominated industry, that there is representation. So this conversation is not only timely because it's what we call it Women's Empowerment Month, but recognizing that there are historical figures that have paved a path for us. So excited to join on the conversation and being on this panel with these amazing women.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Jolley. I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion at Pendo. So at Pendo, our mission is to really elevate the world's experience with software. So we offer a platform that provides digital experiences that users love and that are easy, but also accelerating the adoption of software, so making it easier to use. And in a similar way that Amber and Jen talked about, my mission is to make sure we're embedding DEI in all we do, specifically DEI in our hiring, DEI in our culture, and DEI in our community. So really thinking about our representation, but also what does that look like once employees are at our company? How are we creating a space where people can show up authentically? We are really addressing inequities in our processes, and we're continuing to commit to break bias in all that we do.
I love that. Thank you all for being here. And I want to jump into it as well, Jess, kind of starting with what you were talking about in terms of making sure that diversity, equity, inclusion is embedded throughout the organization. I want to ask how companies can really move forward from that awareness or education piece. And what I mean by that is, for example, conscious or unconscious bias training, workshops, and programming to real action at the organization to mitigate bias? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, this question, before I joined Pindo, so I've been at Pindo a little over a year, I consulted with a lot of consumer brands and large organizations. And this was always a question. We would do listening sessions, we would talk about the pain points, and you would hear from employees, we need to commit to DEI. And the first question after all of that, leaders would ask, where do I start? Like, where do I start with this? There is so much, there's so much historical context once you get through that awareness phase. And my answer is not that insightful or innovative, but I said the same thing. You have to start somewhere, and you have to be willing to try. And so when I think about getting from awareness to action, it is identifying an area that you can move the needle and approaching that with intention and impact. That's the first. Figuring out, a realistic time frame, because in this space, it takes time to change processes and to change dynamics. So what is realistic? And then how are you going to measure that? And so that's some of the core components when it's like, where do I start? Well, what makes sense given where your organization is? What is the time frame, and how are you going to look at that? And I can give an example at Pindo. We recognized we were hiring, and we are in a growth phase. We almost doubled in size last year. So it made sense. We have to think about representation in our hiring, and we need to do more than awareness. And so we really talked about what are we going to do to expand our networks and make sure we have the top of funnel partnerships, and that we're thinking about the diversity of our pipeline. But then how do we make sure our interview process is standardized, is equitable, that we can say we have objectives, ways we're measuring. So we're like, we're going to do this over the year. We're going to look at this. We're going to be intentional. And we recognize that with that, we had to make sure everyone was on board. It's not just my job. It's hiring managers, it's recruiters. And that's a big, big piece. And from that, we saw results. Right now, we have 50% of our C-team leaders are women, which is amazing. And that was a huge increase in percent change. And we also saw a 60% increase in our managers of color, our BIPOC managers. And we took the year, we said, we're going to commit to this and learn. And now we're really focusing on our culture. How do we make sure we have that space where people can grow and advance? And so I think it's trying to just start somewhere, trying to be realistic, and then recognizing, hey, if we're not seeing metrics and outcomes move immediately, that's okay. What can we continue to learn and tweak on?
Yeah, I want to add that, we talk about pipeline development, and it's something that I've been working on, being in the space for over 15 years. And it's important as we think about this multi-generational workforce. But I always like to start with the inclusion, because we have to reflect on the culture. And when we look at attrition, it's the numbers, they've been stagnant, right? So the data is irrefutable. And so as you think about the stagnation, what's happening along that, bringing people in, and then looking at the attrition rate. So it's great that you have diversity as because it is the easy, probably the most quantifiable, where you can say, oh, look, we brought in, a certain percentage. And I always have this dialogue internally where we say, okay, well, of that percentage, where do they sit along the organization? Are they primarily in the human resources? Does that correlate to the subculture within that, because it's predominantly female? So it's breaking down the data to the point where you get very granular, because a lot of companies are, well, we reached the benchmark of 86%, and then I'm like, well, who's filling out this data? Is it representative of the women? And when you say we have 40%, I know Netflix just came out and said, oh, we have 50% of the. I'd like to know where they sit. Are they, that's wonderful that we're reaching, this gender parity. But again, where do they sit? Are they entering these male dominated spaces? Are they behind the scenes doing production and storytelling and directing? So I think it's really important to get to that granularity, but also think about the inclusion piece first. So when I talk about DEI, I know diversity, again, is the first, and it is as a practitioner. But really inclusion, I've come in to assess the culture, and then I'm looking at the attrition rate and saying, is this normal for this industry? Is this normal for this season? Is it normal during COVID? So there's a lot of factors, but I like to lead with inclusion And then certainly what the points that Amber has made very important when you look at the processes and the journey with that, because it does take some time to really deconstruct what's been built for years. And then you have a generation that's been traditional in their approach. And now you have Gen Z that's like, no, we're more socially conscious and we want purpose over profit. So how do you, incorporate those dynamics when you think about the inclusivity piece and you think about that taking to action, right? Taking these concepts and practices, moving from that awareness to action.
I would just add, I think that's so critically important, right? All of the pieces that come together, especially within the last few years, right? Where so many organizations are making these pushes to bring in folks who have been historically excluded, and now they're being harmed in these organizations. So I think it's absolutely critical, right? To think about what kind of environment are we bringing these groups into. And one other build I will make is I love the systemic, view of this. Absolutely. I would just add for those individuals who are looking to, how they move from awareness to action. I would say, the next step after really awareness is what's your relationship with the issue or the bias, right? Like, how do you show up? Because I think in the past, historically, we've tried to shame folks and that just doesn't work, right? Like, it's just really understanding your relationship, acknowledging it, and then thinking about, how do you behave differently? How do you show up in spaces differently? And I think that each of us can do that at an individual level. And, those small actions can contribute to really that culture of inclusion that Jen was getting to.
I just wanted to add one thing, Christina, and to lift up what Jen said around the culture of inclusion. You can ask your employees who come from communities that have been historically excluded, and they will tell you if they would refer friends or their colleagues or peers to that company. And I think that's really critical because if they're like, hey, I don't feel psychological safety, I don't feel like I can be my authentic self, then you have to do work there. So like just hitting on what Amber and Jen are saying of that culture piece has to be important, and making sure you have employees' voices at the table and you're not just coming up with a strategy, in a room without real conversation and context.
And can I just add one more thing? And the solution can't be more leadership development programs trying to fix these groups, right? Like, that burns me. Like, that is always the go-to. Like, let's, develop a program just for people of color or women of color. Like, no, we have to stop thinking the solution is to fix these people and really focus on fixing the environment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Amber. I echo those sentiments, because I walk into, and they're like, I walk into spaces in my career and it's always been, well, we have this mentorship program, and it's, and while I believe that there are programs that can be tailored, it's not the fix all, right? So when you think about, and to Jess's point, really the people that are in the room, and that you're not creating a strategy and vacuum of what's really the reality of the culture. But certainly I think it's important that you think about the conditions that are in place. That's one of the reasons I have a contentious relationship with the whole imposter syndrome, because I know I'm not an imposter. I know a lot of women aren't imposters. So how is that my syndrome when it's really the conditions at play that create self-doubt, that create these sentiments of fear? And I'll just add one more point. When you do these pulse surveys for those DEI practitioners, whether you're getting started or you're new in your role, or if you're an individual contributor, really look at the surveys and the questions that are being posed, because oftentimes they miss the mark. And they're not getting into the lived experience, the rawness of microaggressions, the rawness of, or realness, right? That a lot of women experience, and primarily women of color. So, and oftentimes they shy away from sharing this because, one, fear of retaliation. I know people know that, that there's no such thing as anonymous surveys. Somebody's seeing something. But two, it's also the thought that, what's the point of me sharing that my boss, who may be a white male or may have been at the company for 20 years, I experience these microaggressions daily. What change is really going to happen? So why am I going to lend my voice? And that's where, and Minda Harts, who you all may be familiar, it's a resource she talks about workplace trauma, because we bring the trauma, to these environments, and how is that shared? And I think that's really important to the point of collecting that data about the lived experience.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of key takeaways from this discussion as well, in terms of acting with intention, and pivoting, asking for feedback, being dynamic in your strategy, continually asking how people feel at an organization in a really psychologically safe way, and building trust. I want to talk about how people show up as well, and not assuming that women, just like any other group, is not a monolith too. It's really important. We're talking about women. We're talking about women of color. We're talking about how people feel like they can show up in the workplace. And I want to get specific around how are you kind of providing more equity or leveling the playing field for women of color at your organization. We'll start with kind of Amber for this question.
Sure, right. So, I mean, we continue to read the reports, right, that women of color are having the worst experience at work. And Jen really hit on this when she spoke earlier, right? The way that you get at that is utilizing intersectional data, right? So, we should all be at the point in our organization where we're collecting data, right? We're doing the analysis, but the problem is that a lot of organizations stop at that aggregate level, right? And so what we know is that all of the issues and problems are covered, right? Because white women may be advancing and may be, having some progress and having some level of thriving. But we know when we peel back, drill deeper, that when we think about even the pay gap, right? Like when we look at Black women, when we look at Latino women, when we look at Indigenous women, right? Like it just gets worse with the data. And so that's the first key, right? You have to utilize intersectional data. You have to help your leaders understand that, women as a group are having different experiences, and backing that with the data. And then I think it's getting to your point of intentionality, right? Like, so what are we doing to expand our relationships, as Jess mentioned, right? Like, how are we really being intentional? Are we just going to our outside sourcing firms and saying we need a diverse slate, or are we saying I need to see Black women show up? I need to see this category, show up, and being really intentional about the access and the visibility that we're giving these groups throughout all of our strategies, right? Like when we're thinking about promotion and advancement, how are we being intentional about a group? I think for so long we've been afraid to call out, right? Like, oh, we don't want to look like we're not being fair. But when this is a question of equity and not fairness, it calls for us to be a real intentional and call out the need and the gaps that we see in our organizations.
Yeah, to build on what Amber's saying, I think that data piece is so critical because again, if you're looking at high level, okay, we're talking about women representation. Are we looking at the intersection of women of color? Are we looking at women who might be a part of the LGBTQ plus community or veterans? And then knowing that lived experience is different. And McKinsey released a report last year, Women in the Workplace. They talked about being the only woman in the room, but what it's like to be the only woman and the only woman of color, are the only woman and the only woman with a disability. And that nuance and how the microaggressions, being overlooked in meetings, that is then piled on because of that lived experience. And so I think not only looking at that data, but one thing we're really trying to do is then when we're talking about promotions and hiring, are we bringing that lens of data to look at what does talent mobility look like, not just for women, but for women of color? And what does that look like when, I know Jen mentioned attrition, like diving into your attrition data. What does that look like when you're talking about groups, when we're talking about intersectionality across women and other groups of identities? I think that's important to take data and then make insights from that data.
I'll add, when we talk
Absolutely.
about,
I think that's
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say that just to the point of showing up, we've been hearing a lot or for quite some time, especially after 2020, when it really sparked this massive movement, right? And there was a sense of urgency around these efforts. Now we're seeing which ones were performative. It's starting to bubble up. It's been 2 years. Where are folks with those, or we're not folks, so I'd say leaders of these companies at this moment. For me, you know, the allyship, I go back and forth because it is thrown around, and there's a misperception of what allyship is. And so I like to really refer to it as ownership, like really taking ownership of showing up, meaning do the research, do the work. Don't, you know, when a lot, what transpired in 2020, a lot of folks that didn't really know the repercussions like this, that was nothing new. This is something that's been happening since the birth of our nation, right? So a lot of folks would go to our Black colleagues and ask them for history lessons. And it's like, how are you not allowing folks to process? So for me, allyship is one of those debatable terms because of the misperception out there that it's, oh, if I go and protest for one day, that's me being an ally. Well, it's not just a one and done. It's speaking up when you see women of color experiencing microaggressions. It's being an advocate when that person isn't in the room. So I think it's really important when we think about the action versus just raising your hand and saying, well, I attended a Black History Month event. I'm an ally. I want what's best for this community. I'm an ally. No, I mean, you're opening up yourself to experiences, and it could in some cases be self-serving, but what really is the ownership, your individual ownership at being an individual contributor to not just the workforce, which is a microcosm of society, but even more broadly. So how are you showing up in your communities? Are you looking around? Do people look just like you? How are you stepping outside of that? So I think that's really important piece. And when we think about allyship, is really that active and being proactive versus reactive. So there's just a lot of contention right now within the DEI world around allyship, because everybody's throwing their hands and saying, well, I went and protested. And it's like, well, where are you now? What have you done for the community in a way that's meaningful and really making progress? Not that going to protest and that is not meaningful, but it can't be a one and done. It's where if you're in a position of influence in power, how are you shaping that opportunity for women and women of color specifically, because obviously we know they're the most marginalized. So I'll stop on that point, but I just wanted to focus on, we can't say that everybody's an ally and use that word so liberally without really understanding the depth of it and what it really means to show up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I would add is, for all of those maybe male allies or male identifying allies, is sometimes it's not even an overt action as much as it is stepping back, right? Like, stop taking up so much space and allow, our women leaders, your women colleagues to take that space, encourage them to take that space, empower them, right? Like, help them get access to those opportunities, right? We're always thinking about, speaking up and protesting, but sometimes it's like, how about you just listen and let other voices in the room? Because that's what I hear from women, right? Like, I'm prepared, I'm ready to do this project. I can't get my voice in, right? Like, between mansplaining or, someone talking over me, I'm just not even able to show up. So sometimes allyship looks like, taking less space and taking a step back.
Yeah, I love that, Amber. And Better Allies has a resource, and it talks about how allyship in action looks different. And one example is being an amplifier. Like, I am going to take a step back. I'm amplifying someone else's voice. And I think that's so critical, because we often just think of the advocate, like the protester. I'm vocal. I read the articles. But creating that space, like, I think that's such a huge point. Being an advocate, being an amplifier, being a sponsor, it might look different. And understanding what the need is in that organization and to communities that have been historically marginalized. So I think that's a huge, huge point.
I love that. Creating this space, right? Active listening is a skill. So I feel like it's one of the inclusive behaviors that leaders in positions of power and influence. I want to add that even us in our specific roles, right? For me, I've learned, one, how to amplify my voice, right? That took some time, and I had to go through my own personal journey, and I believe in the power of vulnerability in doing that, but also passing the mic, right? So I've been in situations where there have been other women of color, and because of this circumstance or condition, it's almost like you're pegged to compete against each other because there's only room for one of you. So I always feel like, yes, men have to be a part of the conversation, but also women of color, like, really stepping outside, because my experience as a Latina is not, there may be some universal lived experience, but I can't speak to a Black woman's experience. So I need to know, what that experience is, what that lived experience is within the workplace culture. So I think it's also opening that and paving the path, because I feel like there's oftentimes two philosophies. And there's an article that just came out that talked about female dominated industries are experiencing greater biases. So I found that very interesting. And I personally, in my journey, have experienced biases from other women. So, and I think a lot of it has to do with these conditions where there's only room for one to thrive. No, absolutely not. So I'm of the school of thought, and as a, not only as a DEI practitioner, but as an individual contributor, it really is, how do I pave a path for other women to come through and make it not necessarily easy, but just a little bit less complicated, right? And bringing them up. And so I think it's really important that we get in that mindset, because it really, societally, there's just a lot of competition, and social media doesn't help, so there's just all these factors. And I'm thinking about this younger generation where women are pitted against women, and I'm seeing, my 18-year-old niece, and it's, this is what she's entering into the workforce, right? So how do we lessen that? And I think it's really important, and I'll share that article, but I found it very, very interesting that in female dominated, they experience more biases. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So.
Wow, I would love to see that article. I think it's just so interesting, right? Like how we internalize some of the systems and conditions that exist, because we really buy into this scarcity mindset, right? Like, I'm the only one, I have to be seen as, the successful woman here. And, just really how we help folks see beyond that and shift behind that, and see the value of the many lived experiences and perspectives. So I love that point.
I'm so glad you mentioned scarcity. I'm so glad you mentioned the scarcity mindset, because that's really what a lot, that's the MO in many cases. And so how do we take it from that scarcity to asset-based, or that deficit to asset-based mindset? So I think that's really critical. And I just dropped the article, and actually, I think it was 2 days ago, from the Harvard Business Review, and just very fascinating to see the dynamics of being in even female dominated workplaces.
No one is immune to that bias. We all internalize what we see and what we hear out in society, and we need to really unlearn some of these things as well in an intentional way. Amber, we have a question around one of the points you made around male counterparts talking over others. I've definitely been in situations, I'm sure many of us have been in situations where this happens. And this is an anonymous question. So it's, what is a respectful and professional response about how to handle something like this? And I would love to hear from someone who is being talked over, and then someone who wants to be an ally or an accomplice in the room, who's like, oh, she was just talked over. How can I respectfully say, stop taking up space?
Yeah. Well, I think the amplifying strategy always works as an ally, right? So, being able to say, oh, yes, I heard Rebecca say that before you mentioned it, Bob, or, those kind of things, being able to amplify, right? And bringing everyone back to the original commentator works. I think in the moment, if it's happening to you, a tactic that I use is calling out the person's name who's doing it to me, right? Like, just kind of trying to help them be more conscious in what they're doing. So just, loudly calling out their name. So hopefully they'll pause and stop, and then saying something, to the effect of, I'll continue my original thought, and, happy to, allow you to elaborate once I'm done making my point, right? Like those kind of things, just trying to, because it's all about this, I think most times it's about trying to make the unconscious conscious, right? So how do we slow down, that person's brain for them in a way that is, not going to, shift the room too much, because, your reputation's on the line, right? And so, of course, as any human, you're worried about how you'll be perceived. And so those are some of the things, the tactics that I've picked up in working, right? Like calling out someone's name, and then, allowing that pause, kind of quiet to fall, and then, letting everyone know that you will resume making your remarks, and you're happy to hear from whomever, right? Once you're done.
Yeah, Amber, I'd add to that piece of amplifying. So in a meeting, you can say, Amber was just making a point, and I thought that was a great point. Can we build on that? So I think being able to amplify others, especially if you are in a position of power in that conversation. I also think being intentional if you're leading a meeting around how do you create an inclusive space? So if you see someone who is leaning out of the conversation, how do you check in and say, Jen, do you have any thoughts? Are reaching out after. And I think that's one of the powers with being virtual, being able to use chat, being able to do anonymous quizzes, thinking about other ways. So if someone is maybe not as extroverted or vocal in a meeting, how are you creating space for them to join? I think that's important as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add one stat. Women get interrupted twice as much as men in meetings. So
I believe it.
there's that.
And isn't there some technology that will monitor that for you? I'm not firsthand. I feel like I've read about this somewhere. Maybe you all have experience with that you can include in meetings and it'll kind of monitor that.
If there is, I'm certainly going to purchase a few of those.
Yeah, I feel like there is something like that out there. I have to do some research about there to kind of do that talk time.
Sorry, I opened the box and don't even have the answer.
No,
That's a good point. I mean, that's, leverage technology.
Yes.
I want to lean into kind of, Amber, something that you said in terms of making the unconscious conscious and getting specific, and the additional responsibility around leaders, meeting organizers, just as you talked about. And I want to talk about managers and people who kind of manage across difference, especially in gender or identity. Jess, how should we be thinking about breaking gender bias as people managers, especially new folks who are just starting out in their role and they are managing someone with a different identity than them, and they want to really take intentional steps?
Yeah, I think starting to do some just homework and research on how bias shows up. So you have, prove it again bias or prove it again theory, where it's okay, for women or women of color, I have to see them do something multiple times for it to be successful. You also have kind of this tightrope phenomenon where if I have a woman and I am a manager, I want them to show up friendly, but they also need to be, they can't be too assertive, but they can't be too nice. So we're doing a lot to raise awareness on what are the types of bias. So we're using some common language, or even if it's not bias, how does bias show up, or how do microaggressions show up? So I think doing that work either as an organization or individually as a manager. And then I think it requires some internal work. It requires reflecting and saying, how do I lead? What is my style? How am I being intentional if someone is different than me to create that space? So if I am someone that I am brainstorm out loud, I am talkative, I like to run my meetings that way. Am I doing that work to say, am I creating space for someone who might not operate that way? And so I think there's a systems level piece here, but then also the work that a manager needs to do to reflect and to recognize gaps in their own style, and to acknowledge that differences will bring strength to that team. Because I often think as managers, it can be, oh, someone's different than me, or they have a different style. And that's a problem, when actually saying that is a strength. And if I can help someone with that strength, that is going to help me be a better leader.
Absolutely.
I would just add too that I think managers should be intentional about diversifying their networks, right? Are the people that you connect with constantly people who are like you? Are you, going out of your way to build relationships with people who have different backgrounds, are identified differently? I think that helps, right? That helps with the self-reflection, that helps with your learning, without, necessarily putting your employees under a microscope and asking them to do all of the teaching, right? You are a leader. You should be building authentic relationships with people who are different from you. So I would just add that little piece too.
One of the areas that I've been focusing on, putting much more effort on, is really understanding where there's gaps and competencies. Because as we think about the role of people manager, and we even think about how descriptions are developed, it's not a requirement. I will tell you 9 times out of 10, being a people manager, it's not a requirement to be emotionally intelligent. It's not a requirement to be culturally competent. So there's and even under what emotional intelligence is, there's so many like subcompetency or really just subtext to that. And oftentimes that's what they're missing. And so I lean in on leading with empathy, but understanding that there are people managers that don't know what that looks like. And so really equipping them, providing them the tools and resources, and then start building that into your requirements. That DEI should be a priority for you as a people manager. Being an inclusive leader should be a priority. That should be not just your technical skills, not just the length of time you've been in a specific role, but really that which traditionally has been called soft skills, but obviously we're in the future of work, which it's transformed into something else. It's really thinking about where those gaps are, but start building your people managers to have that frame of mind, that mindset coming in, so that you mitigate a lot of those experiences when you have folks that are culturally competent and understand that perhaps in the Latino community, they don't speak as much, or they speak a lot with their hands as I do. But, and I'm not generalizing, but just the cultural nuances to understand. And I'm not saying to understand the whole gamut, because an individual is so complex when you look at the intersectionality and the multi-dimensions, but just recognizing certain approaches that you can take to be inclusive. And so for me, it's really getting into that specific to prepare people managers to be effective and again, and be leaders, not just managers. Because just because I'm always of philosophy, you could be a manager, that doesn't make you a leader.
Yeah, Jen, your point of leading with empathy, that's huge. And as a manager, do you have empathy, but does your team trust you? Will they tell you if they're uncomfortable? And I think that is such a big piece of management, to the point, Jen, you're sharing, that we have to continue to reinforce and build, because we've done a lot of conversations around what happens if microaggressions happen in your company. Well, do you trust your manager? Do you have that space? Does your team trust you to bring that up? And that's, I think, a question everyone should ask if they're managing people. Have I built a relationship where I can check in, or I know if something's off and I can ask someone? And that's just that foundation of trust and empathy is huge, in addition to like the technical competencies.
And it's interesting because you'll find oftentimes that, because that lends itself to psychological safety. And there's just so many, there's various quadrants to get to a place where people feel safe enough, but oftentimes people are in a state of perpetual fear. And so that's where this workplace trauma comes in. That's where toxic work environments, where passive aggressive or bullying come into play. So I think it's to your point, Jess, that we really need to think about the trust and come from that's creating that safe space so that people aren't in a state of fear.
Absolutely. And something over, my time and experience that has become really critical to this work is understanding that when managers don't understand that someone's background and identity is going to impact how they show up, right? Like you hear I don't see gender, I don't see color, right? I need you to see that. And that's why I emphasize diversify your network, because I need you to build relationships with people so they can share their lived experience. Because, I need you to know that I'm Black, right? and all of that means what I bring, what all the assumptions that are made when I walk into a room. Like, I need you to understand that so that you can fully support me and show up for me. And so I think that's like a missing, when you, Jen, talked about competency, it's something that I think about, right? Like, we have to move beyond this kind of denying identities and the real impact that they make. And we have to create the systems, right? And we have to create the policies that allow our managers to leverage that learning, right? Like, how do we continue, or at least be able to pivot our evaluation process when we know that there are certain groups that aren't going to talk well about themselves, right? They're not going to self-promote, right? And we don't ever want to be in a situation where, well, she doesn't want it, so we're just going to leave her. She's good where she, right? Well, there's so much under that, right? There's so much underneath that. And you as a manager should be helping that employee navigate that. So there's just so many competencies. And I think Jen just hits it on the head. They haven't been prioritized because we're worried about commercial success or, you know, the bottom line and the technical skills. And we just really haven't equipped managers with these tools on how to actually lead people. And I like to call them enabling skills, not soft skills, right? Because those enable
that's the term.
really, right? They enable you to really be a holistic leader and to, you know, be able to tap into that empathy and create psychological safety for your teams.
I'm so glad you mentioned, Amber, I don't see race. You know, I don't know the psyche. I'm not a behavioral scientist by trade, but I do feel this work requires a lot of behavioral science, just awareness and approaches and practices. It's almost saying like, you don't see me. So there's a lot of harm that comes with that. So you don't see, well, that's what I experience. My day-to-day is the first thing people see, and that the experience that I have is this, my exterior, me being a Latina, me being a woman. Yeah, so I think it's really important. And again, I don't know the psyche behind it. I don't know if it's folks denying that they are racist or just, I'm not jumping to that conclusion by no means. But it's really important to educate people that when you make remarks like that, it's actually causing more harm, and you're basically telling that person they're invisible. So I think it's really important to have those conversations. And I've heard over time a lot of managers say that, well, I don't see you as a woman. Well, you know, it's like, well, then you don't see me. So I think it's really important that, and maybe there's good intent, but again, I'm not psychoanalyzing it. I think it's really important that when people say these words, that they're called out on the harm and why it's important to see the person for what they are, because that is part of their lived experience.
Yeah. And Jennifer, I think what you just shared around the intent may be one thing, but the harm is something different. And we've talked, you know, around, you can't just say, oh, well, I had positive intent there. You might not mean to step on someone's toe, but when you do it, it hurts and it causes harm. And so that is something that we have to do within our companies, is say, what was the harm caused? And even in processes, you know, you'll have people say, well, I would never be biased in my feedback. But getting specific, like pulling up examples of, hey, this is the feedback we're seeing, and showing that to your managers. And because I think there is this, well, I'm a good person, I don't see this, and having to give examples and really get granular and use data to say, hey, this is happening in our company, and just agree with all of that of intent versus harm, and really calling that out in companies.
It's unintended consequences, right? But we have to be accountable to those unintended consequences. And so for me, it's with the people managers, it's really about supporting their development, right? Because again, it's not a requirement. It's not something that companies have focused on. But how do we start shifting that and creating a model where that is part of their performance review? That is part of when they get the 360. Well, we can't elevate your role because you're not effective as a manager with your own staff. Like, yeah, you're producing, but you're not focusing on the relational aspect and the most important aspect of the workforce, the human capital, the biggest asset in any workforce. So I think it's really important to hone in on that. But I agree with Jess's point, and just ensuring that those conversations and that data. And one last thing I'll say is I like to get grounded in telling everyone we all have biases. So it's not that you're a bad person. I think when people hear that, it's like, oh, you're telling me I'm bad, like I'm intentionally or like purposely looking at a woman a certain way, or not appreciate it. No, it's that there are blind spots, and these are opportunities to Amber's point of bringing that unconscious and being more consciously aware of it when you call it out, right? So I think it's going to be a lot of learning and self-awareness, but and again, it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's really a requirement of calling it out.
Absolutely. And I just was going to add also to this kind of bad person, good person framework, right? And I often use myself as an example. I've chosen to do this work, right? And I've stepped in it. I've made mistakes, you know, when I thought that I was championing and advocating, stepping in it, because I have bias and I have lived experiences, you know, that are different from even people that I'm advocating for in this role, right? And so you learn through this work that, you know, you're not always going to get it right, but it's sort of how you show up after you get it wrong, right? Like after you make the mistake. And you just have to give yourself grace. You have to extend yourself grace. And so I really try to emphasize that, you know, with my leaders, with the employees in my organization, right? Like I get paid to do this work and I'm very passionate and I've messed up, right? And so the point is you really have to do that self-reflection that Jess mentioned, right? And understanding once you're aware, right? Like what's your relationship to this thing, right? And how can you show up differently? And it's just an everyday act that you have to choose to do, right? To make decisions differently, to behave differently.
We've been talking a lot about behavior changes. Everyone on this call is committed to doing the internal work, which is why I said yes to having this conversation. And it's part of the everyday as well. And I think a lot of people are looking internally, that self-awareness, and want to do better. I want to touch on that systemic accountability piece. And Jen, that you mentioned kind of related to performance reviews and related to kind of compensation as well being part of the conversation. There's companies like Salesforce and Ben & Jerry's where they're making these large goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion and tying it to the performance of the individual. But on a more granular level, what does systemic accountability look like for breaking the bias at work, where it's not just a nice to have, but actually a need to have?
The nice to have has been long gone. So anybody that thinks that this is a nice to have and is in that state of mind, you're behind. So let's catch you up. I think the most important around accountability is the level of transparency on progress. And so the one thing I'm really proud to see is that a lot of, and it's publicly traded companies are required to do reporting as part of their ESG. So you'll see a lot of the ESG, the environmental social governance reports. It evolved from corporate social responsibility to now, okay, what are we doing? What are the environmental impacts that we have? And how are we impacting communities that are under-resourced, right? The social aspect. And that's where a lot of the DEI is often funneled through. But for me, the DEI needs to be embedded because the governance is everything from your board of directors, your leadership, your profitability, your business lines, all of that has to have equity and inclusion embedded. So I'm proud that we're in a moment where there's that level of accountability and transparency because many of them have to, for their shareholders, produce these results. And as a publicly traded company, you have to produce it to the public. So, you know, the compliancy has helped a lot, but it's really important to think about beyond the nice to have. So for in terms of my approach is really deconstructing a lot of the systems at play and subsystems that have created these barriers and hindered opportunity for everything from advancement to and barriers of entry points, even to that particular organization, to even the way that performances are conducted, evaluations, is everybody being measured by the same measuring stick? Are we ensuring that there's approaches in terms of not just training the manager and saying, here's how you mitigate, you know, during the recalibration process, how you mitigate biases, but allow room for others to come in and say, wait, why did you call this person out and lower their performance when this person did something different and it happens to be a white male? And so we know for a fact there's again irrefutable data that tells us that women are not measured the same as men. And so I think it's part of the learning and it should be a requirement. So that's where sort of the systems come in play. But also when you're looking at processes that have been created and built, very similar to how this country was built with a lot of biases, discrimination, and outright racist approaches, we have to think about who were the creators and who was in the room in creating these processes and subsystems. And we recognize that oftentimes we don't challenge the status quo. So when I talk to folks and say, oh, okay, so if we have diverse slate, diverse panel, how did this come about? Oh, this was here when I got here. Well, I'm pretty sure that kind of over time has been there, and nobody's disrupted it to say, well, wait, something's wrong with this. We're not, and this is affecting the way that we see upward trajectory, primarily with women, or how we allow expansion opportunities or upskilling. Again, going back to those female dominated positions, what if there's an opportunity to upskill and transfer skills to get them into the male dominated space that they've actually wanted to be in, but weren't allowed for a number of reasons? I don't want to say allowed, but weren't given the opportunity to. So I think it's really, and in some cases, blowing stuff up. I won't use the word that I actually wanted it to say, but I think it requires a lot of that. And in the DEI work, very similar to Jess and Amber, we do this because we're passionate in it, but we believe in the real systemic change that can come. And it's not easy work, regardless of what people say. It's not fuzzy. You're talking about human conditions, human behavior, and systems that have been at play that predate us for many, many, many decades. And so I think it's really important to think about what that premise is. And again, I was given this analogy of when you think about the grass that it can't no longer flourish, you kind of have to burn everything and start from scratch. So I'm not trying to be radical in that sense, but sometimes we're at that point, we're at an inflection point as a society, and everything we're seeing unfold, that we haven't seen since the Cold War. I mean, all these, and as a microcosm of society, all of this is coming to play. And so I think that, part of our work is really disrupting that and allowing room for those that want to challenge the status quo to do so, and walking along the journey with those that are afraid to, because they're afraid of change. Change is not easy for anyone. So this work does require a lot of change management, but how do we help them, build that level of confidence and empower them to question if something doesn't seem right? Regardless of where you sit, whether you're, I'm not big on titles, but whether you're a coordinator, regardless of where you sit hierarchically, you should be able to speak up and say, I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly in my performance review. Employees talk now more than ever. So they're going to know one way or another if you measure them differently, whether intentional or unintentional, whether consciously or unconsciously. So I think it's really important to think about the accountability and getting that feedback. To me, feedback loop is really important. So seeing how that performance review, that should be embedded in the process to get that feedback. So, going to the initial points that Amber made is really looking at the processes, the protocols, the subsystems, the policies, even the technology we use, which we all know AI does have biases as well. They're built by humans. So I think it's really important that you think about that and rebuilding a stronger foundation so that DEI is threaded in the way that you approach business, whether it's through processes or behavior.
Absolutely. I love that. Challenge the status quo, ask these questions. Who are these systems built for and why? Who does it benefit? Who's not in the room? Who is in the room as well? And really bring these into the fold, into these conversations. I know we only have a couple minutes left and we can talk about this for a much longer time, but I do want to kind of close out our conversation from everyone with a call to action for folks who are listening live and on demand, who are the creators of the now of work, the future of work, and who want to be disruptors as well in terms of mitigating gender bias and creating a really inclusive workspace for everyone. What would be, your call to action for folks listening? And we'll start with Jess and go to Amber and Jen.
Yeah, I think it's something we touched on throughout this conversation, but checking your own bias, doing that self-awareness to understand where you still need to grow and learn, especially on your own journey. And so I think doing that, because you have to be able to have that vulnerability and bring that if you want to lead in this space. I think the other piece is taking the time to rest and pause. I think this space, the work is hard, and it takes time to change systems and the subsystems that Jen was talking about. And if you burn out, then you can't bring your whole self to continue that fight. And so that's something I know is important to me to make sure I'm pausing and saying, we have a lot more to do, but I have to also make sure I am healing and I'm giving myself that time. So I think it's something we don't say enough to each other as practitioners.
Was I next? I'm sorry. I'm inspired by this conversation. So thank you, ladies. This has been great. I would say, a couple of things. So, diversity is people being here, inclusion is being invited to the party. I want us to really explore and interrogate who's planning the party, why are we planning it, who's on that committee, right? Like that's really where we need to shift this work, right? Like recruitment, I know we will always have to do that, we're growing, but really like, why are we here, right? To the point that Jen was making. We know these systems were made long before any of us entered our organizations, and it's time for us to really interrogate it. And then the other thing that I would recommend for the leaders who are tuning in, wondering how they can support their DEI leader and that team, I really see my role as, kind of being the catalyst to helping leaders and employees understand why they should care and, the direction. But we really need leaders who understand the systems and the unwritten rules, right? Like we really need you all to help us translate the work and change that we're trying to see into real actions that the organization can take. We don't want to be seen as superheroes versus supervillains, right? Like we really need to be able to partner with you and come together to make the meaningful change that we seek.
I don't know how I can follow that. I will just say, I echo all the sentiments made by Amber and Jess and appreciate them both. And I love these forums. One, candid conversations. Two, connecting with other amazing women that I know will continue to build our relationships. But I'll just close out with my drive to action or DTA. I know we're preaching to the converted. You came because you're passionate, right? So that's what I usually see when we host events. We're preaching. So I talk about critical mass. So if I'm reaching, there's going to be 1/3 of the population that are champions like you all, that are really passionate, that really want to see the change, and we appreciate you because this isn't just a one person job. And I always echo that, and I'm so happy at the Warriors. Our people ops are like, this isn't just Jen's job, everyone. Everyone has to contribute to building and co-creating an inclusive environment. So I'm grateful that I'm already walking into that mindset. But I'll say that bringing people along. So it's really extending. So for me, it's that 1/3 in the middle that really think it's important, and they'll show up when they feel like they can, and just, kind of like, well, I just want to be a good person and show up to my job. No, this is how you can, let's bring those and convert those to being DEI champions. And then ultimately, human condition, there's going to be 1/3 that don't give two cents, so let's be realistic. We may convert some of those, we may not, and that's okay. So, I think that, going to Jess's point, giving us pause, because I know I've been hard on myself in trying to convert those that are like, there's no discrimination, this doesn't exist. And I'm like, I'm not going to bury myself in trying to psychologically shift somebody that much, from that extreme. So for those folks, I'm hoping that at some point they open their eyes and open their hearts and minds, but I'm focused on that middle, leveraging that 1/3 of the champions that are you all on the call and you all that will see the recording, and helping us bring that other 1/3 up along, because that will help us reach that critical mass for real change. So I'll just end as that to be my drive to action.
Thank you so much, Amber, Jen, and Jess, for being on this panel. And thank you for providing those calls to action, and also for showing up here today and showing up in this work. It is hard and requires a lot of emotional labor. You all seem so passionate about it and invested as well. And we know that it's going to make a difference for so many generations of work to come in the future. Thank you all for joining our webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.